My name is Karthik Shankar, and today I'm going to be talking to you about something very fundamental in ecology. A question that has plagued naturalists, ecologists, and evolutionary biologists for decades, if not for centuries. We're going to be talking today about what a species is. Over the last 200-300 years, and especially over the last 50 to 60 years, evolutionary biologists have argued about different species concepts, and one can think of this as sort of a quest for a species concept that unifies the various processes in ecology and evolution. In this course, we've talked about individuals, we've talked about populations, we've talked about communities, but we haven't talked about that thing in between, which is what a species actually is. And this might seem quite obvious. So if I were to show you a picture of a lion and a tiger, you're going to say, yeah, those are two different species. This is pretty obvious. I mean, anybody should know this. Similarly, if I were to show you a picture of an Asian elephant and an African elephant, you're going to look at that and say, these look less different perhaps than a tiger and a lion, but they're still pretty different. An elephant, a naturalist told me that they are two different species. That seems pretty obvious to me too. But then if I were to show you, for example, an Asiatic lion and an African lion, which actually today are classified as the same species, this gets a little murkier. And sure enough, if I go to some slightly more obscure taxa, like these frogs from the Western Ghats, these are night frogs or wrinkled frogs belonging to the genus Nyctibatrachus, a number of different species look like this. And often, even taxonomic experts, frog experts, can't always tell them apart just by looking at them. So there's something deeper here. We need to understand A, what species are, and B, how we can tell them apart. As I said at the beginning, scientists have actually been thinking about this for a long time. Even before there were scientists, there were people who thought about questions like this. And if you go back 2,000 years ago, Aristotle thought about many questions relating to nature. Now, he in fact studied the natural history of more than 500 species of animals, and he came up with his own system of classification based on what he called 5 predicables. He said there were species, which he called eidos, genus, and differentia, property and accident, and he used the words species and genus slightly differently than we use it today. What he essentially did was to classify a particular a thing, could be non-living or living, as a specific category of a larger category. And so, for example, a human, a species, was an animal, in this case the general category or genus, both words have the same origin, with the capacity to reason, which is what differentiated them from other animals. And so he called this the principle of logical division, and this could be applied to any object, living or non-living, and in every step of the classification you went from a general to a specific, and when you went to a specific category, that had to be differentiated from other categories. And he classified many plants and animals based on this idea of species, genus, and differentia. But not much happened in the nature of systematic classification for the next 1,500 years or so in the Western world. In other parts of the world, including in India, there were people that were familiar with nature that classified them for various reasons. So fishermen classified fish, people who practice medicine classified medicinal plants, and so on. But if you look at the Western world, there were some fairly interesting naturalist perspectives of the world. Edward Topsell wrote this book with this extraordinary title called The History of Four-Footed Beasts and Serpents, describing at large their true and lively figure, their several names, and so on and so forth. right? And of course attributed all of this in the larger context of God and creation. This book incidentally had a subtitle of that was almost of equal length as this title. In this book, in these books, he basically repeats ancient legends, assigning exotic attributes to actual animals, says things like weasels give birth through their ears, lemmings graze in the clouds, elephants worship the sun and moon and become pregnant by chewing on mandrake, apes are terrified of snails, and so on. So if we look back to before the 17th century, what was known about nature was A, based a lot on myth and legend, and B, did not have a objective system of classifying them or naming varieties, and most of it was done on the basis of their relationship to man. In the 17th century, there are some remarkable developments. These start with John Ray, who many have referred to as the excellent Mr. Ray, who was actually born to a smith and herbal healer, trained as a clergyman, lectured in mathematics, Greek and humanities, but really became interested in plants. And when he became interested in plants and started cataloging them, he realized that it was becoming more and more difficult to catalog the different varieties. As I mentioned, plants were classified on the basis of their relationship to man, but as he started to categorize them, the numbers grew from hundreds to thousands. And he wrote this book, The Catalogue of Cambridge Plants, and many people say the adventure of modern science, or the objective, what we call scientific today, description of nature begins with Ray. Now, most importantly, in his work in the field that we're interested in, he collaborated with his student Francis Willoughby, and he and Willoughby started working on the classification of birds. And they actually went back and used Aristotle's principle of logical subdivision, and they based it on form and structure, and not just on the basis of myths and legends and relationship to humans. So for example, they classified land and water birds separately. Land birds were divided into birds with straight and curved beaks. Curved beaks into those that were predators and fruit eaters, and so on. And they reached some of the final groupings after 3 subdivisions, such as flightless birds, while others needed up to 8 subdivisions. And the final groupings, remarkably, still have correspondence with some of the groups that we recognize today. So they recognized crows as a group, they recognized woodpeckers as a group, they recognized geese as a group. So the earliest efforts at classification of nature and the description or the identification of species actually happened close to 400 years ago. Now, despite Ray and Willoughby's work, there was still a shortfall or a lacuna in the way that plants and animals were classified. So Aristotle had introduced the concept of logical division, but he and subsequently Ray and Willoughby itself had these large groupings with multiple species within each one. Ray and Willoughby took this a step forward by basing it on form and structure to a certain degree, as Aristotle had done as well. But there was one other critical contribution that Ray made. In his History of Plants, he said that one of the most important criteria for classifying these was the biological criterion of reproduction. So at a very, very early stage, we will come in the lecture to Ernst Mayer's idea of the biological species. The inherent idea of reproduction and gene flow was first proposed by Ray in the 1600s. His exact words, no surer criterion for determining species has occurred to me than the distinguishing features that perpetuate themselves in propagation from seed. All of this lays the ground for the person whom we consider to be the father of taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus makes some very, very important contributions other than the system of nomenclature. he follows John Ray's work and says that species are bound together by reproduction, which we know to be true till today to the largest extent. And this was pretty important at the time, because he says since they are tied together by reproduction, no new species are produced at the present time. Now obviously he was wrong about this. Darwin and other naturalists, including Wallace, came along about 100 years later and showed how new species were produced by natural selection. But at the time this was important as a counter to beliefs that new species could be produced spontaneously, could be produced by hybridization of different species, and through other processes that that they had, that existed in their myths and legends. And so he said species are real units, they stay constant apart from minor variations. So even though we mostly remember him for a system of classification based on these reproductive characters as suggested by Ray, he sets out 24 classes of plants. He organizes them as order, genus and species, class, order, genus and species, standardizes the binomial nomenclature that we use until today, and interestingly classifies the genus Homo, that is humans, in the order primates with apes, monkeys and lemurs, and doesn't feel the need to make any special comment about this. So with all of that as our background, the idea of what a species is, what speciation is, was sort of the central enterprise of natural history, of what we today call evolutionary biology, over the next 200 years. When Darwin sets out to investigate speciation, other naturalists have referred to it as the mystery of mysteries, the formation of new species. And so this has been the idea of species emerging, the processes by which they emerge, was and is a central question in ecology and evolutionary biology. But the question of what exactly a species is remained fuzzy. And the question that we want to ask ourselves here is, are species real units in nature? Can they be defined objectively? And can real organisms be assigned to one of these non-overlapping species? Now these are three slightly separate questions. The first one is, are species just a human sort of classification construct? Do we just assign it for convenience? Or is there a real biological process that underlies what species are? And if there is a biological process, are we able to use our understanding of those biological processes to define what they are? Maybe they're real units, maybe, and the challenge still can remain in our ability to define it. Now we can agree that they're real units and agree how they can be defined, and it can still pose a challenge for us to assign real organisms to one of these species in nature. So each of these is actually a separate challenge for us. One way of phrasing it is there a special class of discontinuities that delimits these units, which we call biological species, whose definition and description should be attempted because they play a significant role in evolution or in understanding it. This is from a wonderful paper by Robert Sokal and Theodore Crivello, which I'll be talking about a little bit later as well. Now, how have people understood species? As I mentioned, John Ray in the 1600s had also said that there was no surer criterion than the distinguishing features that perpetuate themselves in propagation, therefore the reproductive characters. Interestingly, Linnaeus in the 1700s had pointed out that each species played a particular ecological role, and this sort of paved the way for thinking about species as ecological units. On the other hand, Darwin himself was not very certain of how important the designation of or the category of species were. He said, I was very much struck how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties. From all of their work and the work that contemporary scientists have done, one can classify three broad ways people think about species. There's the Darwinian one that I just mentioned, that species are no different from varieties. We should not expend effort in trying to define them. What we should do is understand the evolutionary processes that underlie variation. So they're just this continuous sort of variation from races and varieties to species to genera and so on, and we should understand the processes by which they come about, but we shouldn't spend time trying to define them. Theodosius Dobzhansky had a view that they are indeed a special class of discontinuities, but there's variation across the tree of life and how evolutionary processes operate, and so it's futile to find a single universal concept, and one should therefore adopt a pluralistic approach that may be taxon or system specific. And Ernst Mayr, who proposed the biological species concept, and others believe that there's a universal species concept, that we should endeavor to try and derive what this is from the principles of ecology and evolutionary biology. And because a lot of people are what I call Mayresque and truly believe that there's a fundamental species concept that can be applied universally, many people came up with species concepts over the years. There are today something like 20 or more species concepts, but we can broadly think about them as four categories. The earliest ones are based on phenotype, that's morphological or phonetic species concepts. Many are based on reproduction and gene flow, which I'll talk about at some length, such as the biological species concept, the recognition concept, and others. Many are lineage based, that's the history of the evolutionary lineage. So the evolutionary species concept, the phylogenetic species concept, and so on are these lineage based methods. And there are some that try to unify across different processes, such as the cohesive species concept, the genotype cluster concept, and the general lineage concept. The most widespread and impactful of these is the biological species concept, which Ernst Mayr proposed in 1942 and then later modified in 1963. He said that these are groups of actually or potentially inbreeding populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups, that these populations do not breed with each other. Now, in later definitions, Mayr actually removed the actually or potentially, and he just said groups of interbreeding populations that are isolated from other groups, because of the challenges inherent in trying to figure out whether these can potentially interbreed or not. Dobzhansky had a similar definition. He said this is a reproductive community of sexual and cross-fertilizing individuals which share a common gene pool. Of course, Dobzhansky later said the futility of attempts to find a universally valid criterion has come to be fairly generally, if reluctantly, recognized. Not everybody agreed with him. Now, early on, actually more than 50 years ago, there was evaluation of these concepts by other evolutionary biologists, and even though today the biological species concept is widely believed, is still widely accepted, there was some pretty sharp criticisms of it. Sokal and Travello said species are defined by distinctiveness rather than difference. They consist of populations actually rather than individuals, and they're defined by their relation to non-conspecific populations. This is how the BSc works. But because the biological species concept is defined like this, you have to find individuals which lack distinctiveness from each other. you have to find a group of populations which does interbreed, and then you have find a group that doesn't interbreed with other such groups. And for this, in fact, you have to get back into the definition of what interbreeding itself is. And so then they said, they asked, do we use the biological species concept for practical taxonomy? In the 1970s or the 60s, they did not. They did not. They used phonetics or morphological differences. Was the biological species concept used in evolutionary taxonomy? No, the idea of shared inherited characters were used in understanding evolutionary relationships. They said, is it a useful heuristic concept that helps us understand the relationship between populations? And they said, no, we use population genetics for that. And they said, does it underlie evolutionary theory? And they argued that biological populations were the fundamental unit for evolutionary theory as well. So 55 years ago, there was very strong criticism of what the biological species concept itself was able to do for our understanding of species and evolution. Now, over the last 50 years, many other species concepts have been proposed, as I mentioned. There are some similar ones like the isolation species concept, which emphasizes the isolation from the biological species concept. The recognition species concept is sort of the opposite. It identifies the recognition of mates and mating systems, but these are all based on gene flow. As an alternative approach to viewing what species are, a series of evolutionary species concepts were proposed. Broadly, the main evolutionary species concept itself said a species is a lineage of ancestor-descendant relationships in populations whereby it maintains its identity from other such lineages, and it has its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. So all organisms belong to some evolutionary species. Reproductive isolation, which is again taken from the BSc, is complete. Morphological distinction is not necessary. And evolutionary species are monophyletic, which means that all populations or individuals in their species are more closely related to each other than they are to any other lineage in the evolutionary tree. Based on these, several phylogenetic species concepts were also proposed. The Hennigan concept says it's a set of organisms between two speciation events or between a speciation and extinction event in an evolutionary or a phylogenetic tree. A monophyletic group of organisms that are recognized as lineages on the basis of shared inherited, shared derived characters are ranked as species. And also others have said is the smallest diagnosable cluster of individual organisms within which there is a parental pattern of ancestry and descent. So these again are slight variants that use the phylogenetic tree to define what species are. At the same time, some evolutionary biologists felt that one needed broader or more inclusive ways of thinking about species. Alan Templeton, for example, said that species is the most inclusive population of individuals having the potential for phenotypic cohesion through intrinsic cohesion mechanisms, which included genetic mechanisms. Similarly, Mallet in 1995 proposed a genotype cluster concept where he said there are groups of individuals that have no intermediates or few intermediates when in contact, but these included polytypic species in the definition and used knowledge of genetics. Now, Mallet proposed that in this concept that species are influenced by gene flow and not defined by it, which he argued was a weakness in the biological species concept. This brings us to the general lineage concept. This was proposed by Kevin de Quiroz, originally in the late 80s, and then he elaborated on it in the 1990s and 2000s. And de Queiroz' idea are that species are segments of population level evolutionary lineages. So he's building on the idea that these are groups of populations, but these populations are segments of these evolutionary lineages in evolutionary time. And what species definitions were doing were implicitly or explicitly equating species with different lineage segments. So if you look at the figure to the left, you have what one might consider to be a single evolutionary lineage, but even before we've split it, certain changes start to happen, right? And there are changes that happen across time. Some of these, they could be morphological, they could be genetic, they could be geographical, they could be ecological, they could be acoustic. Now these are all occurring at different stages. And these different stages, de Queiroz argues, are actually criteria that different species concepts use. So a morphological concept is focusing on something that happens at one stage of this divergence, and others that are based on genetics are focusing on other changes that happen during the course of the divergence. And he also argues that these changes may not take place at the same rate across different taxonomic groups, and so we see, for example, strong morphological divergence in one, and we might see strong genetic or strong geographic difference in another. So de Queiroz was proposing a framework which he called the general lineage concept, which in a sense encompasses all the species concepts or many of the species concepts that others had proposed. He also points out this distinction between concepts and criteria, which I'll come back to when I'm talking about individuals and classes. Now, having said all of that, you might think we've arrived at a shared understanding of what or some understanding of what species are, or how we can understand species concepts and use them to define and delimit species. But actually, if we look at the tree of life, much of this is useful for eukaryotes, in fact higher invertebrates and vertebrates, and even there often they don't apply. And certainly when we look at plants where there's natural hybridization, polyploidy, asexual reproduction and selfing, and microorganisms where you have asexual reproduction and high levels of recombination, most, or perhaps in some instances, all of these species concepts don't apply very well at all. And so we have to recognize also the limitations in applying what we've learned about species or about species concepts across this larger tree of life, where in fact the animals that we're applying them to form a very, very tiny small branch of that tree. So de Queiroz talks about the distinction between concepts and criteria. Another way of thinking of them is by asking, are species individuals or classes? Please note that when I say individuals over here, I don't mean individual organisms or individual objects. I'm talking about individual entities. One could think, for example, of the Indian Institute of Science as an individual organization or entity. Now let's think about, how do we decide whether somebody belongs to IISc or not? Is that student a part of IISc? Is that faculty a part of IISc? Do we ask, do we say this individual is tall, has glasses, has a beard, and these are attributes that faculty at IISc have? It may actually be true. However, that is not what defines our membership to this organization. Our membership is actually defined by the contract that we have with it. Our membership in a family is defined by our relationship to our parents and siblings. That family is an entity regardless of what features or attributes its members have. Classes, on the other hand, are defined by features, attributes, or characters. I can define a chair as having certain characters. I can define a table or a car or a building as having certain attributes or features. That is how we define class membership. The interesting thing about species is that when we try and define them using these concepts, we're actually treating them as individual entities. If an organism was born to certain other to its parents, to its ancestors, if there's an ancestor-descendant relationship, we say that they belong to the same species. Now, even if that organism were to have mutations and look completely different, we would still define that particular individual as belonging to that species, right? So, in concept, we often treat species as individuals. However, in practice, when we're using traits such as morphology for the most part, and even when we use genetics to a great degree, we are asking if the individuals have certain attributes or not, and if they have those attributes, then we assign membership to that class. So the challenge here is that in defining species or in framing species concepts, we treat species as individual entities, but in practice, when we're assigning membership of individual organisms, we treat them as classes. So why do we care about all this? There are some practical reasons. In the modern context, with all the anthropogenic impacts on biodiversity, there is a fear that unrecognized endangered species may become extinct. Species that are incorrectly identified or diagnosed may be hybridized with other species. Resources may be wasted on abundant species or hybrids. Populations that could be used to improve the fitness of inbred populations may be overlooked, and endangered species may be denied legal protection. So very often there are widespread, what were believed to be widespread species, and when more recent modern methods have been used to understand their taxonomy and systematics, scientists have found that the species, that they comprised many different species, and some of those species may actually be quite isolated or small in size. So what should we do? Following on Kevin de Quiroz's general lineage concept, we need to follow a broad integrated approach that also takes into account the underlying evolutionary processes. So I'm going to pause for a second here, digress for a second to talk about the types of speciation. And there are three broad types. There's allopatric speciation, when populations that are separated by a barrier diverge from each other, and in sympatric speciation, which can often involve chromosomal mechanisms, there is no barrier between the two species that diverge. And in parapatric speciation, there might not be an obvious barrier like a valley or a river or a sea, but the barrier is in the form of an environmental gradient. So populations at different parts of this gradient are perhaps adapting to different climates and diverging from each other. Now, this is critical because in identifying species, we actually want to separate it not from some other distant species, but from the species that it's most closely related to. In fact, the question we're asking is, this population that I found, how closely related is it to the population that it is genetically closest to? Is it far enough apart from that I think it warrants designation or delimitation as a new species? So this has broadly been described as an integrative taxonomic approach, which combines genetics, geography, and morphology. We use a phylogenetic given the methods available to us today, we use a phylogenetic tree as a starting point. There are increasingly refined methods to build these phylogenetic trees, both in terms of the molecular markers available, as well as the analytical methods available. And so this phylogenetic tree allows us to assess which taxa that we are amongst the taxa that we're studying, which of those clusters or units are most closely related to each other. Once we've decided, we found these clusters, and if we think some of these are unidentified species, there are many analytical and computer algorithms that are available to estimate the number of possible lineages in this phylogenetic tree. So we could set aside, in fact, the species that we know and say how many lineages do we think are here, and how many of those lineages correspond to the ones that we already know and are described. We should then use each lineage, as de Quiros in fact suggests, as a hypothesis, and in the sense that we say this lineage may or may not be a species, and then we can evaluate them using a set of criteria which can include genetic distance, how far are they genetically apart given the molecular markers that we have data on, what's the degree of geographical overlap. So if in many taxa, geographical barriers can serve as important important signals for an evolutionary process, and of course there are taxa in which morphological divergence also occurs, but equally there may be many instances where species have diverged substantially along the genetic axis. There's clear geographical separation in evolutionary time, but because they experience the same climates, that they did not morphologically diverge from each other as well. There may also be instances where there's substantial morphological divergence because different populations experience different environments, but they didn't genetically diverge and are not, and they are in fact not different species. So generally speaking, and this varies, when we say high divergence, that might vary a little bit across different taxa on the tree of life, but when we identify sisters with very high divergence, we generally say these, that even if there's no morphological separation between them, that these have been separated for so long in evolutionary time, perhaps 10, 15, 20 million years, we would treat them as different species, and the species that have diverged less or moderately, we would examine other axes such as morphological distinctness and geographical separation in order to use now multiple criteria, also others such as ecological differences, other signals of speciation in many groups that can be vocalization or acoustic data such as frogs and crickets and so on. So we'd use all of these multiple criteria to support the evidence from the phylogenetic tree and the genetic data to arrive at a informed decision about whether they're species or not. So to wrap this up, coming back to some of the examples that we started out at the beginning, genetic data in fact has shown over the last 2 decades that African elephants are also not a single species and are from the there's a savanna elephant that's widespread throughout southern and eastern Africa, and the forest elephant that's found in central West Africa. And king cobras, which are distributed all the way from the Western Ghats in India to the Philippines, that for the last close to 200 years have been thought of as a single species, have very recently been classified into 4 different species, again initially on the basis of categorized into 4 different groups, evolutionary groups on the basis of genetic data, and subsequently into 4 named species on the basis of morphology and geography as well. All right. So in summary, naturalists have been trying to classify species for centuries. Linnaeus in the 1700s provided the first structured modern classical framework. Many species concepts have been proposed, from the biological species concept to evolutionary species concepts. But the challenge is in applying these concepts to the taxa that we work with, including many animals as well, but substantially for plants and microbes. The general lineage concept does offer a framework for combining these concepts and viewing them in a unified framework. And at a practical level, we use an integrated taxonomic approach combining genetics, geography, and morphology. So with this little understanding of what species are, it continues to be both a philosophical and a practical challenge for ecologists and evolutionary biologists. But we're going to hold those thoughts and keep sort of thinking about it and raising questions for ourselves as well about it. But going forward, we are going to take as an article of faith that the species that we use as units in understanding diversity and in understanding community ecology have been identified with some degree of precision and confidence. We'll continue on that train of thought in future lectures. Thank you.